Welcome to a bonus video for all of my observations when testing DLSS in Control and how it compares with when it's disabled. Although Nvidia would describe DLSS as an upscaler, I'd rather describe it as a mixture of anti-aliasing and sharpening, and it certainly tackles the problem in some new and rather interesting ways, which I'll show in this video. It's meant to use AI trained on high-res images of the game to intelligently blur jagged edges, but I've heard it might not even use that in this game. It doesn't matter. I'll judge it on how it performs in the game using a GeForce 2080 Ti. Running Control on absolute maximum settings at native 4K is not a good idea. I got 20 to 25 FPS and it wasn't a lot of fun. Dropping to 1440p with DLSS increased it to a very playable 40 to 50 FPS, which I felt was okay, though disabling a few of the more problematic ray traced features certainly smoothed it further and edged it closer to the magical 60 FPS mark. And at 1080p it remained well above 60 FPS at all times, even with everything on. But again, remember that I'm using a 2080 Ti here, so you'd hope this would be the case. But for this video, most of it will be rendered at below 1080p, and then zoomed in, because a lot of the changes DLSS makes are at the pixel level, and this isn't too visible when viewing the screen as a whole, especially what with YouTube coming along and being all compressed and stuff. So just remember that what's shown in this video might not be quite so noticeable when playing the game at a proper resolution. So how is DLSS in Control better than it used to be? I think the main reason is that, at least now, it's honest. It doesn't claim to be 4K while actually running at a lower resolution. It shows you what resolution it's running at, and lets you choose different base resolutions. And it works at any screen resolution. In other words, while these improvements still don't give DLSS any real benefits over other methods, its implementation in Control does remove a lot of its disadvantages. This made it easier for me to run about and to see what DLSS actually does to the image. So you know, I don't think you can run Control without anti-aliasing. You can choose between MSAA, DLSS, or without either, it still looks like it's using temporal. So in this video I'll be comparing DLSS to that. Temporal is already quite an effective form of anti-aliasing that's widely used in modern games. To summarise, DLSS typically runs 1 to 2 frames per second slower, which depending on resolution can be somewhere between 2 and 5%. I could have sworn the difference was greater than that when I first tested it, but I tried all kinds of resolution combinations and it remained, at most, just a frame or two slower. DLSS was better at retaining detail on things when in motion, while temporal would pixelate the whole thing. But this came at a price. It introduces visual bugs. You can make out halos around things in the foreground, which I think is it attempting to use data from past frames and somewhat failing. I think you'll agree that the plants in the foreground look better with DLSS. They retain their smooth edges and the definition on thin blades of grass. It's just that it's at the expense of the background. DLSS appears to prioritise things in the foreground, and it's down to personal preference whether you think that's an improvement or not. The visual artifacts reminded me of the effect that you get when converting 30 frames per second video into 60. Obviously slowed down at a base resolution at 720p is a worst case scenario. If you use a higher base resolution like 1080p or 1440p, and run the game at normal speeds, then it's nowhere near as noticeable. Anyway, by spending endless hours running about the same boring old corridors at different settings and resolutions, I've grown familiar with DLSS and how it works. I can now identify when it's on, and wish to share with you what I've learned. Comparing the first frame of a new viewpoint, where it has no past frames to help anti-alias the image, reveals how DLSS works. When faced with a fresh, aliased image, it paints a low-resolution, defocused water painting of it that blots out high-contrast spots, then fills in the details over the next dozen or so frames. The first frame is technically inferior to regular anti-aliasing techniques, but I think to the human eye it looks better because it minimises the number of stray, high-contrast pixels. We don't notice the water paint effect on the first frame as much as we would a high-contrast area that hadn't been anti-aliased. I say it takes a dozen or so frames for it to reach maximum quality, but within a fraction of that it's already pretty much there. Its defocused approach reduces the speckly look of noisy surfaces, and while both methods suffer from flicker, I think DLSS can end up using more individual frames than temporal does, as its flicker is slower. This sometimes worked against it, producing a far more noticeable flickering effect, particularly on this transparent glass, which unfortunately for DLSS is everywhere. Ha ha ha! So it's not a clear-cut victory for DLSS. Apart from in this particular case though, it's generally a cautious type of anti-aliasing. It would rather blur, or even hide, high contrast edges entirely, so I do think there are cases where you might prefer the look of temporal. A perfect example of this is on the wires holding up the lights here. Temporal shows a rather aliased result, while DLSS chickens out and effectively removes them completely. I thought the edges of these pipes were interesting. DLSS removed jaggies more consistently than temporal could, whilst somehow managing it with less blur. I think sharpening deserves some praise here. You can definitely see the contrast being upped along the edges in the DLSS example, almost as though Nvidia are borrowing from AMD's Fidelity effects. Despite temporal's greater amounts of blur, you can still make out the pixel stepping along some of the edges. Not sure if this is from the anti-aliasing or from the upscaling, but luckily, since I'm only comparing the end images, I can simply say that DLSS does it better. There's a graphics feature in Control that really doesn't play nicely with DLSS, and that's the ray-traced indirect diffused lighting in this game. In fact, it comes with a whole host of its own problems as well. I guess it's a more accurate simulation of ambient occlusion, but it's not really worth using because it adds smeary artifacts around anything moving. It tanks frame rates, and when DLSS is enabled, it makes some surfaces look horribly pixelated, the worst offender being this wall here. DLSS appears just to upscale this effect without making any effort to smooth the result, meaning you're left with obvious low resolution squares across some of the walls in the game. I prefer Temporal's solution to it, which is to blur it back to 1999. Since it does tend to run 1 to 2 frames per second slower than Temporal and doesn't always deliver superior results, I wouldn't say that DLSS is a clear-cut victory in Control, but it certainly deals with aliasing that Temporal might otherwise miss, and I do find something appealing about such a novel solution. If you're anything like me, then before this, you may have assumed that DLSS added detail to the upscale, when in actual fact it just offers a relatively alias-free solution that can, if given enough time, provide a low blur, high quality result, with fewer upscale artifacts than with Temporal alone. But when DLSS gets it wrong, it gets it very wrong. So that's a taste of the DLSS implementation in Control. See the main video for more information on it.